You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 204. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Here's a question for you. Is the grass actually greener on the other side of the fence? This is a question that a lot of lawyers are asking themselves, and maybe you're one of them. The question being, is the job that you're in the right job for you, or would you be better off if you crossed the street and joined another firm? This is a question that a lot of lawyers really grapple with because it means leaving a situation that you've worked really hard to build, where you are invested, but you're not entirely clear about what the future is like for you. Now, this week's episode is kind of fun in the sense that I've been watching some reality TV. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit it, but I have watched almost the entire new season, I guess, of Temptation Island. It's 10 in this series. I don't know if that makes it a season. And if you've watched Temptation Island, well, then we're in the same boat. If you haven't watched it, don't judge, please. It's a show about couples, 4 couples in particular, who go to an island basically to test their relationship. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And as I was watching the episodes, it occurred to me that there are a number of parallels between what these couples are experiencing on the island and the reasons that they ended up on the island in the first place, and the lawyers that I work with and who I speak to who are struggling with whether or not to stay or leave the job that they are currently in. So starting with lawyers and what this can look like, and maybe you can relate to this scenario, a number of lawyers feel very stuck in the job that they are in. And they don't know whether to leave that job or to stick it out and try to make it better. And what I've noticed is that this comes up a lot with lawyers who are more than a couple of years into practice. Usually this is something that maybe you feel it right away, but for the most part, I think it happens maybe, a year and a half to 3 years into a particular role, and you're really starting to wonder if this is the right place for you. And maybe the reason lawyers that I speak with who have this problem have been in their role for longer, right? If you're really unhappy, maybe you just up and leave. But when you've spent more time in a place, then you may feel more invested. You've spent time, energy, you've made a lot of effort to learn the law, the practice that you're in, to develop relationships with the lawyers and the other members of your firm, right? The people that you work with directly, the clients of the firm. You have spent time trying to grow your practice within the organization. And also, maybe you've been really trying to support the organization grow its practice. And so there's this feeling of having invested very heavily in a particular organization. And what you might feel then is that the job is fine. It's okay. There are some things even that you love about it, but there's this gnawing feeling in the pit of your stomach that it's not sustainable. So if you were looking at it as a romantic relationship, you might be asking yourself, is this person truly the one, right? Is this the person I want to spend the rest of my life with? Is this my soulmate? You're questioning that. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. Maybe it's the nature of the work that you're involved in, right? The work that comes across your desk, by the nature of the clients that your firm has or the work that your organization does. You might find that there is a bit of a disconnect, right? You don't necessarily see yourself wanting to do that type of work for the rest of your legal career. You might find that there's something not quite right about the community of people that you're working with. You maybe don't feel like you really fit in, or you're making the right connections while you're there. There might be a lack of opportunity. You might just look 2 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out, and ask yourself, is this really right for you? You might look at the more senior leaders in the firm, for example, and say, I don't really see myself as being one of them or being among one of them. Or you might just see that the opportunity isn't going to be there, right? You look at the other lawyers who are at your level of call and you see the writing on the wall. Only a certain number of you can progress to a certain level of leadership, whether it's partnership or whatever it is that you're looking at. And maybe you just don't see how it's going to work. And so that makes you feel discouraged. And so what happens then is you might feel this lack of connection with you and yourself being in that organization in the future. You might feel unsettled. A lot of lawyers that I speak with feel like they're not fully valued for what it is that they contribute to the organization. They may not feel appreciated. This is really common, right? The standards for lawyers are really high, and you don't always get that feedback from your colleagues or your bosses or your clients. I mean, they're busy, they're stressed, they might not have time to give you that feedback, or maybe the feedback that you're getting isn't feedback that's clearly encouraging. You might find that you don't feel heard, right? You've tried to raise something more than once. You've maybe asked for more of a certain type of work and you've been told it's just not happening, it's not possible, or yeah, we'll do it, but then nothing really changes. And you might also find that you see other people getting opportunities that you're not getting, right? Others are being promoted, whether it's to partnership, whether it's simply being given access to files that you would like to have yourself. And so you find yourself in this state of turmoil, right? It's almost like you're on an emotional roller coaster where one day you show up at the office and everything goes really well and you meet all your deadlines and you do great work for your clients and you get some positive feedback and you feel like, of course, this is where I'm meant to be. I'm happy. I'm on a roll. But then the next day you show up and, you get a dirty look from one of the lawyers that you work with, or a client sends you a really difficult email, or you get a new file and you realize this is just not the kind of, file that you want to be working on. And so then it changes. And so you can find yourself flip-flopping from day to day, feeling like, yes, this is the place, or no, this is not the place. And the way that you might describe that to yourself is using language like, I feel like I'm 1 foot in and 1 foot out. I feel like I'm on the fence. I feel like this is not sustainable. And it can be really hard then to plan for your future because you don't know if your future is going to be where you are or if you're going to move somewhere else. And what happens at maybe a less conscious level is that you're not going all in. If you imagine yourself in a relationship, for example, where you're not really sure about the person that you're with, again, I'm thinking about Temptation Island, but you don't have to have watched Temptation Island to be able to relate to this. If you've ever been in any type of relationship, whether it's a romantic one or a friendship, even some family relationships or other situations where you're kind of on the fence about it, you might be able to relate to that feeling of lack of going all in because you just don't know what the future holds. You just don't know if you're going to be in that relationship for the long term. And so is it really worth it for you to have the difficult conversations? Is it really worth it for you to invest the energy in building up that relationship if ultimately you're going to leave? You might feel that same way about your work. Does it really make sense to try to make it better if you've already decided in your mind's eye that you're ready to move on? So what happens here is you're choosing, consciously or not, the comfort of what you know versus taking the risk of potentially finding something better. And what you might be feeling is a hope day to day that your current job is going to get better. And you might see little glimmers of possibility. Going back to what I just described, those days where everything goes really well, you might think, this isn't a bad place for me. In fact, this could be a great place. And you might also be feeling a lot of fear. Fear that if you were to leave your current job, that you'd find something worse, that you'd go and you'd make the effort and you'd burn all these bridges and lose out on your current opportunity and find that actually where you are right now is a lot better than where you could end up. So this could be describing a situation that you've been in before. Maybe you're in it currently. I can tell you it's fairly common. I can say that because I have felt like that in the past when I was practicing law in certain roles that I was in. I also see it in the clients that I work with, the coaching clients who come to me who want to make a transition and who feel really stuck. And so they want the support of a coach to help them through that. And today's conversation really is discussing the parallels between relationships. And again, I'm thinking of Temptation Island, but you don't have to have watched it or even understand it to be able to relate to a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. The parallels between being stuck in a relationship and being stuck in a job where it's just not working out. And if we think about relationships and how people feel stuck in relationships, there's a lot of commonality there. You might feel like you're heavily invested in a relationship with somebody and yet be unclear about what that future actually looks like. It might feel really hard, especially in a romantic pairing, if you're looking to get married. And a lot of the couples on Temptation Island were questioning. That was the big decision. Do we stay together and get married and spend our lives together? So it's kind of a forever thing, which is big commitment. Do I go all in on this or not? And that's how you might feel about your job too. It's a big commitment. The job that you're in shapes the future of your career going forward. And so people are very conscientious about making the right choice. Again, if you're in a relationship, you might feel that emotional roller coaster where one day everything is going the way you want and the next day it's a mess. There's that hope of the relationship improving. You might think, I'm with this person. I really care about them. I can see the potential here. Maybe it's not perfect, but I can see how it would get better, right? Often there's a hope that the person is going to change for that to happen. There's fear that leaving would be worse. You might not want to be alone. You'd rather be in a relationship that's maybe a bit dysfunctional or not perfect because it's better than being on your own. And then finally, that feeling of stuckness, that feeling of, half in, half out, not really knowing how to move forward and feeling like you're treading water a little bit. So there's a lot of parallels. And what I'm going to talk about today, I've got 10 lessons or 10 parallels that I'm going to discuss that relate to both relationships and relate to being stuck in a job. And the reason I'm doing it this way is I think it'll be really relatable. I think it will really help to put things into perspective if you are in a state of stuckness. And it doesn't have to be your job or relationship. It could be some other area in your life where you're feeling a little bit stuck. It might just be really comforting to know that you're not alone and to see that this is so normal. And also, as you hear me go through this list, you might also find inspiration. You might generate ideas to help yourself get unstuck. So with that, I'm going to dive in, starting with the first lesson, which is that the status quo, even the status quo of stuckness, has a lot of momentum, and it can take something quite drastic to pull you out of that status quo. So the image that comes to mind for me is the spin cycle of your washing machine. And if you've ever heard a washing machine in its spin cycle or you've seen it, you know that it's spinning really fast and everything is moving in one direction. And if you want to stop that cycle, you would really have to do something different to make it stop because all the momentum is going in one direction. So if you're in a job, you are in a momentum, right? You go to a certain office every day, you talk to the same people, you have a certain way of running your files, you've got your email inbox with all of the email that's coming in, you've got your files. There's a lot there. There's a social network, very likely, that you have tapped into. There's a certain identity that you have within your organization. And so there's a lot of momentum that is pulling you and pushing you in a single direction, just like in a relationship. If you've been with somebody and you've been with them for a period of time, maybe it's 1.5 to 2 years or longer, chances are you've got routines, you may live together, you've got friends in common, your families know each other, etc. So there's a lot of momentum that has built up and is pulling you all in one direction. And so if you want to break that cycle, if you're feeling stuck and that you're questioning whether this is the right job, the right relationship, and you want to do something different, you want to examine that, you might have to do something really drastic in order to break the momentum. So in the case of Temptation Island, I think the participants on that show really made a big sacrifice in order to get out of the stuckness of their relationships. In my opinion, they must have been feeling a lot of pain in the stuckness that they were in order to be willing to put themselves in front of the world, to have cameras follow them around all day long, to have their innermost thoughts and emotional experiences put on display for the world to see. Now, this is my perspective. I don't know what they were thinking. Maybe for them, it was an opportunity to spend time on a gorgeous island and to meet all these fantastic new people. And maybe there are some other benefits that come from being on reality TV. I don't know. I only see it from my perspective here. But for sure, there was a big commitment being made on each of their parts to go and do something radically different from what they were doing before in order to pull themselves out of the stuckness, which for the show was make a decision to stay together, leave the island together, leave the island alone, or leave the island with somebody new. So if you're thinking about that in terms of your job, there's this momentum that has built up and you may need to do something drastic. I don't know that reality TV offers career coaching. Maybe there's the equivalent. Who knows? But certainly working with a coach. I know for a lot of lawyers who retain me to help them with a transition, part of the reason is that they need that accountability. They know the momentum that is pulling them forward is very strong. And if they want to do something different, they need to carve out the time, and making the commitment to work with a coach is such a change, right? It is a relatively purposeful, possibly drastic, although I don't know that I would call working with a coach drastic, but certainly it's intentional. There is an investment that you would be making. There's time, there's money, there's energy, there's focus. And that is a way for you to break the cycle. There are other things you can do. You can quit your job. You can apply for a new job, get a new job, work with a mentor, have an accountability partner, etc. But the idea here is that there may be a requirement, depending on how much that momentum is carrying you forward. There's a deliberate intentional action that will need to be taken in order to pull you out of that spin cycle. So that's lesson number one. Lesson number two, people stay too long in relationships and in jobs because they think innocently yet incorrectly that they are doing the right thing. So if we look at some of the stories of the characters on Temptation Island in terms of why they're in the relationships, and you can tell pretty early on in the series which relationships are healthier and which are not as healthy. And when you see the couples describing their relationships and why they are in it, even if those relationships aren't really working out very well, reasons that they give, showing to others that they can do it. So one of the participants was talking about how their family had a lot of divorces. And so committing to their partner and showing up for their partner and not breaking up was a way of proving to themselves and a way of modeling for others this idea that you can stay in a relationship, you can commit. There may be moral judgment about leaving, about not abandoning somebody. And I hear this from lawyers as well, both in the sense of, wanting to prove to themselves that they can do a certain job, or maybe wanting to prove to others or gain the support or admiration of others for being in a particular role. There's often a moral judgment that people place on themselves for leaving. They feel like they've really developed those relationships within their firm or organization. They've got mentors, they've got mentees, they've got clients, and it feels morally wrong to leave those people hanging. There's also this idea of wanting to give people second chances, hoping that they are going to change. And that is really tricky in relationships and in jobs, where hope is the thing that is driving you. And you may have heard the expression, hope is not a strategy. It really isn't. It doesn't resolve anything that comes from a really good place, but it doesn't necessarily bear fruit. And then there's this idea of fear motivating the decision to stay in a relationship or stay in a job, the fear that you might not find something better. And I find this is often rooted in a lack of self-confidence, a lack of self-trust. If you're concerned that you're not going to find a better role, then you might want to investigate that, whether you investigate that with a coach or a counselor. That I find is something that can really hold people back. And if you can resolve the confidence question, you can feel a lot more confident about the decisions that you make going forward. And then finally, one of the reasons that was offered in terms of staying in a relationship, which I also see in jobs, is this idea of FOMO. And I'm not sure that it was articulated in Temptation Island, or that even people are articulating it that clearly when I'm working with them as clients. But there's this idea that, you might miss out if you leave something, if you leave your job, and what if things get better? And you would be fearful of missing out on that. Or if you're in a relationship and what if they find somebody and you see them having so much fun and then you fear that you're missing out on that. So FOMO can also be a pretty powerful driver. And so the result of this is that you stay longer than you should, whether it's in a relationship or a job. And because you're not really there for the right reasons, I hope that doesn't come across as judgy or harsh. It's not my intention. But if you're in that situation, what you might find is that the relationship sours, and sometimes it becomes more difficult to move on because that momentum continues to build and you become even more entrenched. And then what can then happen is, in order to justify staying, you tell yourself stories that justify staying, and you increasingly believe those stories, and those stories start to really stick. And again, if you are working with a coach, they can help you see what some of those stories are. And if you're watching other people, you can really hear those stories a lot more clearly sometimes than you can yourself. So that brings us to the third lesson, which is the story that you tell yourself about your relationship shapes the experience of your relationship. And you really see this on Temptation Island because we are spectators. And so when you're watching something on television, it's really obvious that there's a story being written there. And it's obvious from the editing. Me, as a watcher of this show on television, I'm only seeing on the screen that which the producers and the editors have decided to show me. So I already know that my perception is limited. So if we go back to the reasons for going on reality TV in the first place, I gave you my list of reasons why I think it's a terrible idea for me. What I don't see necessarily, what isn't shared with me in the show, is why people felt like this was a good idea for them. Like, what were their motivators? And yeah, they share some of the motivators, like we want to come to a decision and whatever. But we never really see the full picture. We only see a portion of the picture. And sometimes that's really obvious, sometimes it's not. Another place where you see this on Temptation Island is that they do these bonfire sessions where the host of the show offers up video clips to one half of the couple. So they have a bonfire with the boys, they have a bonfire with the girls, and when they have the bonfire with the boys, they show them footage of their girlfriends and what they're up to on their part of the island. And I'm sorry, I didn't really explain the premise of the show very well, but basically the couples are separated. The men go to the men's villa, the women go to the women's villa, and then in each of the respective villas, there are a number of temptresses or temptors. So in the girls' villa, there are all these young men who are hunky, I suppose, and in the, God, I sound old. And then in the the men's villa, there's all these women, and it being an island, a tropical island, everybody's running around in bathing suits with their washboard abs, etc. So this is the idea of the temptation. The couples are separated, and then the tempting people are there to basically test the people who are in the couples. And so then they go to the bonfires and they show footage. And so what you can see very clearly as a viewer is that the couples are only being shown snippets of what's happening. They're not being shown the full story. And we know that as viewers, but they don't necessarily know that because that's all that they see. And so that's the obvious ending. What's less obvious, and where you have more control actually, is in how you interpret the story, what you choose to focus on, what you choose to see. And this is really interesting when you listen to how the participants describe their experience. It's clear that it is their perception of the experience. And one of the things that the host did in the show that I thought was very interesting is he would show a clip to a participant. So it's, show clip to girlfriend A of boyfriend A, and he's, I don't know, doing something that, she doesn't like or whatever. And then the host would ask the participant who just viewed the clip, what did you see? What did you see? And it was such an interesting question because the implication there is that people are going to see something different in the clip, right? And so choosing what you see in a clip, what you are experiencing in a relationship, what you are experiencing in your job, there are different layers to that. There's what you actually have access to. So if you're in a job, for example, there might be conversations that you're actually present for, and there are conversations that you don't see. If you, for example, see someone else getting access to a file that you really wanted access to, you may not have seen the conversation behind closed doors where they were saying, that lawyer really needs more hours, or we need to give that lawyer an opportunity to work with this particular client. You may not see a conversation that makes perfect sense as to why something is happening. You might just see, I didn't get invited to work on that file. There's probably something wrong with me. So number one, there's that filter of what are you actually seeing? And then there's that second filter, which is often unconscious, of what you're actually taking in. We know that our brains filter information for us, because if they didn't, we would be completely overwhelmed with the volume of information that is out there in the world. So our brains are filtering, and then we are further filtering the information that we choose to focus on. And so that lesson there then is that the story that you are telling yourself about your experiences shape your experiences. They shape your relationships. They would shape your experience of your job. You only have access to a part of the story, and what you have access to is further filtered. And so what we want to be conscious of here is, what are the stories that you're telling yourself? And in Temptation Island, you really notice there's a couple of characters that really cling to the victim story. Everything is somebody else's fault. They have done something to them. And this can happen in your job too, where you start to see yourself as a victim. And it may be true, right? It may be that there are things that are happening that you don't like, that don't feel fair. And there's also merit in trying to look at a story from different perspectives, because it's empowering for you. If you can move away from the idea that everyone else is doing it wrong, and you can take more responsibility for what's happening, then you actually get to take your power back. You get to see where you have agency and authority and power, as opposed to where others are having power over you. So that's the third lesson or parallel, is this idea that stories matter, and you can tell yourself better stories potentially. I'm not meaning to single you out, dear listener. I don't know what stories you have currently on the narrative. And again, just tying this back to working with a coach, coaches, of course, can help you with the stories. So can counselors, and so can your friends. I mean, the trouble is, friends, mentors may not feel comfortable sort of sharing those stories based on not wanting to hurt your feelings, etc. So it can be hard to get that feedback. That brings us to the fourth parallel, which is, and this is so interesting when you are watching somebody else, your blind spots are much more visible to the viewer than they are to yourself. And you've probably heard the idea of being blind to your own faults. There is so much truth to that. In coaching, you sometimes hear people talking about the fish in water, right? Fish floating around in water don't see the water, and nor do we. We do not necessarily see the water that we are floating around in. We don't see necessarily our blind spots. And it can be so easy to sit and judge others. If you're watching a show, especially if it's a show like Temptation Island, where it's designed to elicit a reaction in you. There's so much TV, especially reality TV, where it's almost like, you're being provoked in a way there's a show I was watching with my daughter recently. I can't remember what it was anymore. Oh, it's driving me crazy. But there was a character on that show, and both of us would be like, oh my gosh, eye rolls, etc. So sometimes something is there to provoke you to judge, and sometimes you're just judging because you're observing, and it's really a lot easier to see from the outside looking in than it is when you're actually inside the equation. And so the lesson here is, we all have blind spots, and sometimes it can be really hard to see them. Interestingly, and you really see this in the show, when you're complaining about somebody else, and you might see this in relationships that you have that are completely independent of Temptation Island, but you might have people in your life who routinely tell you stories that are really the same version of, or different versions of the same story, right? The complaints are the same. If they had a theme song, it would go a certain way. And what I've noticed is that what you complain about in others is often equally true about the way that you treat others, and often the way that you're treating yourself. So, for example, one of the women in the show complained a lot about not feeling valued by her boyfriend. And yet she was not valuing her boyfriend. She was speaking about him in quite a harsh way. And you can also see how she was not valuing herself. At work, for example, I've worked with lawyers who talk about how they don't feel like their firm or people within their firm are communicating with them. They're not giving them what they need. And interestingly, when you dig a bit deeper, you can also see how they are not communicating with others. They are not giving them what they need. Boundaries is another area where you really see this, where people who struggle with boundaries, often the boundaries start within. They're having a really hard time asserting boundaries with others, and they're having a really hard time asserting boundaries with themselves. And so these blind spots, I said it's really easy to judge. It's also really wonderful to have compassion for the blind spots, because people do not typically go around doing things on purpose that are not serving themselves or others. It's unconscious so much of the time. And when you're able to identify what the blind spots are, then it's so much easier to do something about it. And so again, if you're wanting help with blind spots, right, that's an area where it can be really helpful to have a coach that you work with who you can invite and say, listen, I'd really love to know what my blind spots are. I have clients who ask me for that specifically, and then I watch for them and I feel comfortable sharing those blind spots with them. It can also be really interesting if you work in an environment where there's group coaching. So I do group coaching in different capacities. One of the things that I offer is a 6-month group coaching program with a group of women lawyers. And what I love about that is that because you are in a group and because people are sharing their experiences, you can hear other people describe the situation, and you can often see maybe a blind spot for them. But what you might see that is even more powerful is your own blind spot, because what somebody else is sharing is so relatable. And when you're able to hear it and see it more objectively, you then start to notice it in yourself. And from there, you can develop strategies to move forward. So that brings us to number 5, which is resentment builds up and it is toxic in a relationship. And I am going to recap this list at the end of the podcast. So don't worry, if you're trying to keep track of items 1 through 10, I will summarize this for you. So resentment, this will not come as a surprise to you. Resentment is that feeling that you get when you feel like you've been wronged and you just can't let it go. And resentment, I notice it a lot where you're giving a lot, where you feel like you're really sacrificing, you're really putting yourself out there, you're doing more than your fair share, and then you feel like it's not reciprocal, you're not receiving what you were hoping for. This can happen especially if it's unclear. I see this quite often where you may be doing acts of service for somebody else in the hope that they do something very specific in return for you, but you don't ask them. And so when they don't do it, then you feel really annoyed that this hasn't been reciprocated. Sometimes it stems from that. So in this show, they show how these couples, after a year, 2 year, 3 years of holding on to something that was really bothering them and festering them, end up in this state of resentment. And one of the couples, who is actually quite a strong couple, they had a really festering resentment brewing. The boy or the man in the relationship had felt like he was second choice at the outset of the relationship. There's a few facts that go along with that. And that feeling of being second choice lingered throughout I think it was like 2.5 or 3 years of the relationship, and created this real chasm in their relationship. He was resentful, she felt guilty, and it was a block, a barrier to their relationship moving forward. And so as long as he holds onto that resentment, the relationship is not going to be able to move forward. Other resentment examples from the relationships, couples where one of the parties had cheated and the other party was resenting that, unable to move forward from it, unable to trust that person again. In a job situation, chances are you're not having that same feeling of being cheated on or something like that. But there are other ways that you might feel resentful at work. You might feel like you're putting in a lot of time, a lot of effort, and you're not being acknowledged for what you're doing. There may be financial considerations. It may have been that at the last bonus season, you weren't given the bonus that you were hoping for, and you feel resentful over that. Maybe your compensation level hasn't kept up with that of your peers, and you feel resentful about that. You may have been passed over for opportunities. Maybe they're discrete opportunities like files that you wanted to work on, or maybe it's partnership or taking on certain leadership roles within the partnership. And as you feel like other people are getting opportunities, or maybe you're doing more than your fair share of mentoring of associates, whereas others aren't really doing that mentoring, you might find that you receive feedback from somebody and it feels unfair, right? That it wasn't really coming from a place of understanding what you've done. You might feel like your workload is excessive, right? You have way too much on your plate. It could be billable, it could be non-billable, a combination of both. And you feel like that's unfair and you resent that. Or it's the opposite. I mean, this happens too, and it's almost worse. I think it's worse than being too busy is not being busy enough. When the market in your area is slow and the work's not there, or the firm just doesn't generate that type of work. And so that can feel, you might start to build resentment up there. So these are all areas in which you might develop a feeling of resentment at work. And we see it in the relationships, right? It's really obvious that the romantic relationships are souring. There's that resentment. And so the people in the couple need to make a choice. So going back to the example of the guy who felt like he was second choice, it was really obvious. He either needs to get over that resentment and move forward with that relationship, or let it go, let the whole relationship go, because that relationship is stalled until that resentment is dealt with. And the same thing may be true at work, right? You may be able to move past it. There might be something that happened. It was discreet. Maybe there's a conversation that you can have to right the wrong, right? If it's compensation, maybe it gets adjusted and you move forward and everybody's happy. But if you choose to stay, then you need to let go of that resentment, or it's not going to work. It's going to continue to build. It will be toxic to your work relationship. And so you're really faced with that decision of, can I live with this? In which case we need to move on from it. And if you can't, then it means you need to move on. And either way, whether you stay or go, and this is true of relationships, it's true of work relationships, is when you move on, I strongly encourage everybody to find forgiveness for whatever wrong there was that created that feeling of resentment in the first place. I highly recommend that. I remember my grandmother used to tell me, my paternal grandmother, that forgiveness is about you more than it is about the other person. And it's true. If you're harboring resentment, it's eating away at you. The other person probably doesn't even know, right? They probably don't experience it nearly the same way that you do. And so you want to figure out how to let that go. I also heard a really interesting idea recently that forgiveness is not even necessary when you achieve a level of almost compassion or empathy or understanding that everybody who does something does it because they think it's the right thing to do. And if you can see things that way, then there is no wrong. When there is no wrong, there is no need for forgiveness. Now, as I'm saying that out loud, I'm thinking that there are situations where that really just would not be possible. If you think about some of the wrongs that people can commit, and I'm thinking now about some pretty heavy types of wrongs, but in some cases, the wrong or the perceived wrong may simply be a difference. It may be something that if you can find a way to understand it, forgiveness is not even necessary because you don't even see it as a wrong anymore. So that's just an idea in terms of resentment. Where you have it, it will be toxic to a relationship. And in order to move forward, it means accepting, letting go of the resentment and staying in that relationship, staying in that job, or leaving and just deciding that it's too much, it's not going to work. And regardless, to make peace with that because you're making that peace for yourself, not for the other person necessarily. So that brings us to item number 6. Who knew that there were so many lessons that could be taken from Temptation Island? This one is not going to surprise you. Complaining without action is a dead end. It will not bring you closer to the person you're in a relationship with. In fact, it will very likely push them away, and the same is true at work. So when you watch Temptation Island, if you decide to ever watch it, or when you hear somebody complain about a situation that they are complaining about, but not taking any action about, it is quite obvious. And so in this show, what you see are a couple of women in particular like to complain about their boyfriends. It starts at the very beginning. They talk about all their boyfriend's faults, how they are the worst boyfriend ever, and they give lots of reasons for that. They leave the toilet seat up. They are, not accountable. They are cheaters, etc. And they carry this with them, right? Everything is their boyfriend's fault. Their boyfriends are bad. And then, of course, they show clips. The producers show clips of the women saying these things with their boyfriends to their boyfriends who are over in, their temptation villa with women who are throwing themselves at them and telling them that they deserve better, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can see how complaining, it makes that person, it pushes them away. It makes that person feel less than. It makes that person feel unwanted. It makes them feel unvalued. And it, I think, stems from this desire to actually be closer, which is kind of the sad and ironic part of it, right? We're complaining and there's that passion, right? There's that desire to want things to be better. They want to be number one. They want to be picked. They want to be loved. And so they complain, but instead of bringing that person closer to them, it actually just repels them. It pushes them further away. And if you think about examples where you've complained about something, chances are the more you complain about it, the less warm and friendly you are when you show up for it, right? If you're complaining about your job, you might find that you show up and you're unhappy, you keep to yourself, you do what you need to do, but you're not going and trying to go that extra mile. And then, of course, it shrinks your role, right? People may feed off that energy and they're less inviting to you. They don't necessarily approach you. Maybe they find that you're being unapproachable. And so it's this self-fulfilling prophecy, right? By complaining without taking any action, it's like you end up creating more of what it is that you don't want. And so this is where it can be really helpful to have a coach who can help you to see what kinds of action you might start to take. You don't need a coach, right? You can also do this on your own. If you find that you're in that cycle where you're complaining and you're not really doing anything about it, it might be having that honest sit down with yourself or sit down with a mentor or a trusted friend, speaking with somebody at your firm who maybe can help you or your organization, depending on where you're working. The key here is you want to move from that place where it's just complaining without taking action to actually doing something for it. And part of it, what I was going to say, is taking responsibility. So where you really see growth is where people take responsibility for what's happening. You don't need to take responsibility for all of it, but just some of it. When we can start to see our part, then we feel much more empowered. We can start to change things. And so, again, you're wanting to take action. And this isn't necessarily you, dear listener. This is my observation of this show and what I've observed in people in my coaching practice and people outside of my coaching practice, right? We all know, and sometimes we're those people, right? I can think of examples of myself where I've certainly complained and not taken action. And I know that. So anyhow, calling myself out here as much as anybody. And that brings us to lesson number 7, which is that lessons only have value if you apply them. So you've maybe heard that expression, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And in a relationship, you can see it happening. And on the show, you could see, for example, that one of the struggles in the original relationship was that one person was cheating on the other. And so they go onto the island and immediately they start cheating on their partner. So that's an example, right? The lesson isn't really being applied. There's a lesson there, but nobody's making a change. And the same is true at work. You might notice at work that there are opportunities for lessons, right? What I see often are opportunities to advocate for yourself, whether it means setting better boundaries, whether it means getting the type of work that you want, whether it means building the relationships that you want in your organization. So there's these opportunities to create an environment where you're going to thrive. And if you do not do those things, right? If you don't set the boundaries or you don't pursue the opportunities and you find that in firm A, it's not working. If you go to firm B without making changes, without learning how to set a boundary, without learning how to advocate for yourself, chances are you're going to make similar mistakes in organization B. Now, sometimes the context of the container, the context of the job is so different that maybe the problem goes away on its own. I would invite you to be conscious of any habits that you might bring from one job to the next, from, relationship analogy, from one relationship to the next. You just want to make sure that you're focusing on the lessons that you have drawn and applying those lessons. Which brings us to lesson number 8, which is that as humans, we want to have it both ways. This is so normal. And it's so easy to see on TV. There's, all these, again, going back to Temptation Island, these guys, they want to be able to go to their villa and have whatever relationships with these women at the villa and still have their girlfriend and go back to their girlfriend at the end of the day. They want it both ways. The women want to sit and complain about their boyfriends and how terrible they are. And at the same time, they want their boyfriends to love them and cherish them and value them. But they can't really have it both ways. The same can be true with your job. You might be sitting in your role thinking, I just don't want to be here. I want to be in a different environment. I want better opportunities. And at the same time, I want this to happen for me. I want it to be certain if I go to a new job that it will be better. And so we want that certainty, but we can't necessarily have that certainty. We want it both ways. And so it can be really paralyzing when you can't necessarily have it both ways. And it's totally normal and totally human. And so I want to acknowledge that we want it both ways. And if we want to make forward progress, sometimes we're going to have to sacrifice on one of those ends. Either you stay where you are and you absorb the discomfort of knowing that things aren't going to change, or you decide to make that change knowing that there's going to be some risk involved of the unknown. That brings us to number 9, which is that some people just aren't a good match for each other. And some people and jobs are not a good match for each other. And you see that in this temptation island, that some of the couples are just not going to work out. And you know that about yourself and about your place of employment. And so you've probably heard friends of yours talk about their jobs, and you can kind of tell that, that job is not working out for them. And that's okay, right? Because somebody else might really thrive in that very same position. There's some really amazing work that's done through the Gottman Institute about couples, married couples. And they have studied couples for decades. And one of the things that the Gottman Institute talks about is this idea of unresolvable problems and how all relationships have a certain percentage of unresolvable problems. And I can't remember the percentage, but it's relatively high. So in your job, in your relationship, you're going to have problems that never get resolved. And the question is, are those problems ones that you can live with? Or do you want to trade in your job or trade in your relationship for a different set of problems? And so again, going back to this idea, some people are going to be a great match. Others are not going to be a great match. And that's okay. It's okay. And maybe the answer is you just need to find a different person, a different job. And that brings us to lesson number 10. There is no right answer. So I don't want to spoil the end of this show just in case you decide to go and watch it. But I guess it's pretty obvious from the beginning that some people will stay together and some will not, right? And so for you, if you are thinking about whether to stay in your job or leave your job, there's no right or wrong here, right? I mean, there are options. One option is to stay, right? On the show, one of the options was to stay in the couple, leave the island together. That's one option. Another option is that you might decide that you're going to stay, but you're going to stay for a limited amount of time. I often do this with clients. I say, well, how long do you want to stay? How long are you willing to give your current role before you make a move? And the reason that I ask this question is because it creates a container for you now. It creates a time frame, and you can have tests and measures within that time frame that you can use to decide whether or not you want to stay or go. So if you're in a relationship, you might say, okay, well, we're going to give it a certain amount of time, and here are the changes that I need to see in order to stay in this relationship for the longer term. So, one option then is just stay status quo. One option is stay with a time frame and conditions. One option is just to leave. Lawyers leave jobs without new jobs lined up. Sometimes that is a good option, right? If you find you are so busy and overwhelmed and you don't have time to think about what you want, let alone apply for a different position, sometimes that can be an option. That would be like the person leaving the island alone. They want some time on their own. Another option would be to get a new job. This idea of leaving the island with somebody else, maybe as you're working, you're able to find a different role, find something that aligns a lot more with what you're looking for, the person that you are now, the career that you want now. You may have entered the job that you're in years ago where you didn't really know what you wanted yet, or you didn't have the experience to know what you wanted yet, or you thought this is what you wanted and it's no longer what you want. And so you're allowed to change that. You're allowed to redecide. You're allowed to change course in your career. That's totally fine. And so maybe that's the option that you choose, but there's no one single right way to do this. And, if you look at the different couples and how couples are going to come to different conclusions, if you look at your colleagues and yes, they will also come to different conclusions, it's okay. There's no right or wrong. And so if you do decide to stay in a job where you feel stuck, I do recommend figuring out how to make that job the best job for you, whether that's through hiring a coach and working on some of the skills and things that you can do to improve. Often it involves having conversations with people at your workplace. It involves making some changes, etc. Or it may be that what you really want to do is change out of the situation that you're in and find a new one. So that is the list of lessons that I have for you. And I'm just going to recap them one more time. Lesson number 1 is this idea that the status quo has a lot of momentum. And so if you find yourself in a stuck cycle right now, that, laundry and the spin cycle, it's got a lot of momentum. There's a lot that's keeping you in a particular position. So you might need a little bit more than a nudge in order to shake things up. Lesson number 2, you may stay too long in a job or relationship for reasons that seem right, that seem compelling, and you might want to question those reasons. Again, you might want to seek support in terms of helping you to uncover what those reasons are and whether or not they are reasons that you like, reasons that you want to have you in the job or relationship that you're in. Number 3, the stories that you tell yourself shape your experience, so you want to be mindful of the narrative. And again, there's what you actually are exposed to, what you actually see, what editors choose to let you see. And then there's also what you perceive, the internal perception, what you choose to focus on. Those all influence the stories that you are telling yourself. And of course, the stories shape your experience. Number 4, we all have blind spots, and it is so much easier to see other people's blind spots. We are like fish in water. We don't always see them. And when we learn about what those blind spots are, it can be really empowering. And again, just going back to what we discussed, what you'll often notice is that what people complain about in others, and even what they compliment in others, often reflects what it is to be true about them, things that they are themselves doing. Number 5, resentment is toxic and it builds up. And so you either want to move on from a relationship that is toxic, or you want to let go of the resentment. And in either case, you want to find forgiveness for whatever it is that you are resenting. Number 6, complaining without action is fruitless. So again, we just want to avoid that cycle of complaining and creating more of the thing that we don't want. Again, that idea that when we complain, we're often pushing away the very thing that we want most. 7, lessons only have value if you apply them. So again, we just want to learn what's happening and then move forward with the benefit of making some positive changes. Number 8, as humans, it's normal for us to want to have it both ways. So we can accept that about ourselves. We can love that about ourselves. It's totally normal. Number 9, some people are not a good match for each other, and some people and jobs are not a good match for each other. And that is also okay. What we want to do here is know that there are going to be unresolvable problems, and we want to choose the set of unresolvable problems that we can live with. And then finally, that number 10, there's no one right answer. There are lots of options available to you. You can stay, you can go. It's entirely within your discretion. You have that power, you have that choice. And maybe it is sometimes just reminding yourself that you have that option. You don't need to stay if you're unhappy, and there's support available for you if you do want to make a move. So thank you. That is what I have to share with you this week. I hope you have enjoyed this podcast episode. I hope that you found it to be relatable, that you can see the parallels, and that what we've talked about today has brought about some moments for you as we were talking that shed light on things that might be happening for you at work, possibly relationships at work, possibly relationships outside of work, where you're able to see things in a new light and you feel perhaps inspired and empowered to take positive action. So thank you again. It's been such a pleasure connecting with you. I look forward to reconnecting again next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.